Welcome to another great panel discussion from PTP. So today we're really going to be talking about security protection and security detection. A lot of advancements going on in the marketplace when we hear terms like EPP, endpoint protection, EDR, endpoint detection and response, MDR, managed detection and response. And we're going to talk a little bit about what all of that means. And just kind of get into the details of that solution, the technologies that we use, and then really for PTP as an organization that's a cloud consulting firm working primarily with life sciences companies, organizations that have data in ELM systems, in labs that are trying to move that up to the cloud, that have scientists that are doing experiments and having bioinformaticians all over the world being able to access data in different places and do work with that data. Really, how we're helping them understand where their data exists, how to help secure the data for the end users that are accessing that data, and then obviously from a detection perspective to identify indicators of compromise and really understand when there could be possible threats to the organization and how we can quickly stop that. So today I'm really excited to be able to have some industry experts in the space. The service that we deliver from a PTP perspective, leverages technologies like SentinelOne from an endpoint perspective. And we're going to talk a lot about the tools and how they work and what's under the hood. And then our Fluency Security partnership to be able to aggregate all that data, make sense of all that data, and be able to provide actionable data to a SOC team that can triage and escalate and remediate as appropriate. And so that's really going to be today's discussion. So excited to have that discussion. I'm excited as always when I get to do and host these events that I can learn from those that are that we're talking to today and help us really kind of understand the landscape. So I do see Rick was able to get on. Thank you, Rick. I know you're not feeling 100%, so I'll try to just try to do the best you can. And unfortunately for you, you get kind of teed up as the first panelist with the first question. What I just asked for the panel team, to Nick and Gabe and Chris and Rick is, maybe when I come to you with your first question, just a quick pause and a brief introduction on who you are instead of taking the time to do the round table now. Let's just do it when we get to you. But it'd be great if you could just share just a little bit of a background. So. Sure. So with that, Rick, I was kind of explaining to our audience a little bit about the service, the tools and the platform that we're using. As the leader of our managed services organization, if you could just give us some high level perspective on how the SentinelOne and the Fluency tools work and the functions they perform in our monitoring, I think that would help before we dive into the technology specifically and just give some context to our audience.
Sure. Good morning, Rick Pitcairn, VP of Managed Services for PTP, based out of Cincinnati, Ohio. I've been with the organization for almost 5 years. Boy, time moves fast, I tell you, when you're having fun. Have over 26 years in IT, got my start on the engineering infrastructure side, and for the last 15 years, I've been leading IT teams. And I own service delivery and operations for PTP, including our Security Operations Center and Security Engineering team. So from a tool perspective, when we look at Fluency and SentinelOne, I think it's important when we look at security, if we look at it in layers, to make sure that we have the right visibility in place for security and event monitoring, reporting, in order to do triage and remediation. What we do is we look at each element as a data source from within the infrastructure, with the goal to ingest that data from those sources into Fluency. What Fluency is doing is it's performing real-time threat detection and alerting, behavioral analysis. It's developing risk scores around that data as it's pulling it, and it really correlates all of those events and data between all the devices that we have visibility and we're monitoring within the infrastructure. So once there is a security event that's triggered, that data and that event is sent into our security operations center for incident scoping, mitigation, and escalation as needed. SentinelOne would be a data source from an endpoint perspective, so that's feeding data into Fluency, which in turn is feeding that data into our ops center. And that was kind of the high level quick view. So
that's perfect. I really appreciate that. And really, over the last couple of years, things have changed so much just with our workforce. Years ago, people were in the safe confines of, four walls, behind firewalls, behind, office VPNs, and that's not as much the case now. So I think that just amplifies the importance of, improved user level security as they're in hotels and coffee shops and home offices and things like that. So I think that we'll get into a lot of that detail. And then, as you said, Fluency becomes that, hey, how do we take those data points and that intelligence from the endpoint and from the network and from our Office 365 environment and pull all that together so we can make sense of things? And that's the Fluency piece. And Chris will certainly be able to address that. So let's get into a little bit of, I mentioned some of the terms, and Chris, I'll come to you next. And like I said, maybe just a real brief, introduction on yourself. But we talked about, I mentioned the term EDR, I mentioned MDR. There's also XDR. Can you talk just a little bit about, what's the roadmap of endpoints and XDR in general, and just talk about where that's going? I think that would be really helpful, is to make sense of some of that terminology for our audience.
Yeah, Chris Jordan, co-founder of Fluency, the other co-founders behind a wall over here. So we've been doing streaming analytics for the last 8 years, really ahead of the game in that. Before anybody started looking at trying to do things in real time, that's been our main focus. Prior to then, I had a company that was purchased by McAfee that did AI, ML detection of new events and generating signatures on the fly. And then before I started doing development work, I ran certs. So I was one of the initial Army cert guys, started Army cert, then took over DoD DisAssist, which became DoD cert, JP Morgan, DuPont, FAA cert, DTRA certs. So I was really into operations. But what I found in operations was that the tools just weren't there. So I like development, so I went into tool development. And that really brings you into where we are today with Endpoint, because Endpoint's changed significantly. When at the old days when we were at McAfee, we still had DAT files, push down DAT files, and everything was network centric. And with the creation of EDR, two things happened. One was it was a massive change in how we manage the endpoints. So let's go over the first two phrases you hear all the time: EPP and EDR. So EPP stands for endpoint protection, and it's mostly looking at file analysis and file usage, right? And it's standalone. It doesn't go to the cloud for anything, for exception of maybe reputation checking, which in the old days in McAfee, that would be Artemis. So that kind of began the bridge between leveraging the cloud for detection, and then moves in EDR. Now, EDR you would think would be around detection and response. Really, the response part's not the main point of EDR. EDR is a architectural change where the cloud adds additional pieces of information, mostly on what we call indicators. So we use the term indicators of compromise or indications of compromise. Indicators are actually a lot more wider than that. And it's what most people, when they think of IOC, are really talking about indicators. Now, what an indicator is something that occurs in user land other than the file action itself. So in other words, if a process does something in user land and makes an action, a user performs an action, these are things outside the scope of the file analysis or file integrity. And so that's just outside the scope of the EPP. So most of the time, that work is now being done in the cloud. And the reason why you don't want it done on your machine is actually speed and performance. If everything is being analyzed on your machine, nobody likes a slow machine. And so EDR really started offloading that into the cloud, plus it gains what we call global awareness. And it's moving us forward into a more understanding of the UEBA space, user entity behavior analytics, of understanding objects as opposed to just looking at files. So that's the EPP space, the EDR space. And then the next one after that is XDR. And X just means we don't know what the letter should be, so it's everything. And it's, instead of endpoint, it's web services, right? So it would be WBS, which was already taken, right? And then you'd have network devices, email devices. And so what Gartner did when Palo Alto Cortex came around is they, like Gartner does, they like to create lingos. They created XDR. Really, XDR was initially intended for only a single company to do it, right? But now we realize that's absolutely stupid, right? We had boom boxes in the 80s. People who like music have stereo systems. You do the best component possible. So XDR became open platform XDRs. And so general, what that just means is that I'm integrating all this stuff, and XDR is now becoming a fancy word for SIM. Now, fast forward, you bring up the MDR. MDR is actually a change in the way services run. So when we take a look at the way we did services before, everything was network oriented. But now that we're looking at the endpoints, we've changed everything to be more endpoint specific. And so if we're going to manage an endpoint separately, it's MDR, managed detection and response. And so that's a major change. So the bigger change in the MSSP world is it means that we change our, not just our way we do things, but we change our financial way of doing things. We price things the same way we price the EDR, by endpoint. So anybody who's actually doing MDR, they're going to price you by endpoint or by end asset, which perfectly aligns with people like SentinelOne. Now I can go out, manage the SentinelOne, have services, and I'm not charging you by capacity. I'm charging you by number of hard set assets under management. So there's my 2-minute answer in like 20 minutes.
That was exceptional. I will say that was the clearest, actually most concise explanation of that. That was also thorough that I've heard. So really appreciate that. And to your point, I think on the understanding the behavior of the users, and that's obviously the model that we've gone to, and being able to price the services on a per user basis. And what we avoid there, not to, necessarily bash our friends at Splunk, but things that are, we don't want our customers to not want to send data to us. We want them to send the data to us and send the right data to us. So if we have a pricing model that discourages that practice and costs a lot more the more data that we send, we don't necessarily have the right model. And so what we've worked with the Fluency team and how SentinelOne integrates into that for us is, here's your price per user based on the number of users that you have, no matter, what you have in AWS or on the network, et cetera, we'll ingest that. So appreciate you bringing that up. So we've got our primer from that terminology. Now I think I'd like to go, Gabe, we'll get to you next. And we're going to get a little bit more under the hood on the SentinelOne piece, because I think it's important to explain to the audience, not just, it's not just another EPP or EDR tool, but to really understand the functions and components that have given SentinelOne that recognition in the marketplace. So we'll dive a little bit deeper under the hood, but maybe for a starting point, if you could just share with us the main areas that you see as differentiators for SentinelOne versus the other common competitors that we hear in the market.
My name is Gabriel Sechrist. I've been in cybersecurity for about 10 years. I started with Symantec, so I know legacy AV really, really well. Everything from Trend Micro to McAfee, Symantec, of course. And then I've been with SentinelOne for the last 3 years. And I think I have had a pretty good front row seat of how things have changed in that time frame. And simply put, I always think, before I jump into our differentiators, I think it's always important. I've found that a lot of people don't know who we actually compete with. And so I thought just give us a little context of where we fit in the market, how we see ourselves in the market, and how other people see us. So the legacy people that we typically find would be Trend Micro, McAfee, Symantec. The next gen AV people that we compete with would be Cybereason, Cylance, Carbon Black, and then everyone's heard of CrowdStrike, of course. CrowdStrike would be what I would call our main competitor, and we have a lot of feature comparisons to them. We do some things better, they do some things differently, but the two that I don't think get mentioned enough in the space are Microsoft and Palo Alto, which you had mentioned. Often when we're competing, with Microsoft, they end up giving a lot of things away for free. So sometimes if we lose that deal, we never knew that it was a deal to be lost to begin with. So that one's frustrating. Nick and I cover a lot of the Northeast, and we find not only are we working with biosciences, biopharmacies, biotech in a lot of areas, I know that they're either looking at CrowdStrike or moving off of CrowdStrike. So we see them, most of the time. But to answer your question, where we really shine out of any legacy or next gen AV solution is the single agent architecture, of course. It's a whole console, a platform, and then all of that is backed up and augmented by the SentinelOne marketplace, which Nick and I will talk about a little further. We do have rollback, which to me is the best safety net that you could possibly have. So if we completely miss it and the automation misses it, which never happens, but if it were to happen, we would be able to roll back to a previous known good state. The MITRE attack framework and the results that we've been able to achieve over the last 3 years, number one, 3 years in a row. I will admit, in the last round of evaluation, we didn't outperform everyone by leaps and bounds, but number one is number one. And so that was good. I think we have one of the best EDRs on the market, hands down, but I'd go toe to toe with anybody in the market. Better than that is the API first approach. Kind of put it in perspective, you think about Palo or Microsoft, who've been around for 40 years or so. They've built out API integrations. They have 900 or so. We have half as many, and we've only been around a quarter of the time. So in 10 years, we've made some major headway with our technology partners and integrations, and leaps and bounds beyond any of our key competitors, specifically CrowdStrike. We have feature parity. This is a huge one. So Mac, Linux, Windows, feature parity across the board. More importantly, though, is that we can still help and protect legacy systems. So anything, legacy Windows, legacy Linux, we cover more of that than anybody else in the market. Data retention, inevitably, as you guys all know, as we're funneling these logs, either through Cloud Funnel or we have them in a SIM, regardless of what that SIM might be, data retention is an obvious question. We do it, but we can funnel it to local storage, cloud storage, or a SIM of your choice. And then the last two big things I think are the multi-tenancy capabilities. So you can really have a global architecture broken down into sites. So that makes you more agile as you have not only workers working remotely, but as you have, new sites in different areas, whether that's a co-location or whatnot. And then most importantly, as everybody makes this migration to the cloud, it's our ability to protect AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, and any hybrid cloud offering that you might already have employed. But those are the key ways that we seem to get victories over here at SentinelOne. And then I would say the last two things that I'll say is they're constantly innovating to make the product better, and then we're constantly onboarding new and better technology partners. So we're not a static technology. We're moving with the times, and I think that's key if you're going to make investments into anything.
Yeah, you bet. No, thanks for that. I think obviously that helps understand the competitive landscape out there and some of the key features. I'll tell you, just to be open and honest, a lot of these startup biotechs that we work with, they got to move forward. They have a certain amount of cash. They've got a certain amount of time to prove out the therapies or treatments that are their hypotheses, and they're looking at efficient ways to use their dollars. And one of those ways is saying, hey, I'll just get a Microsoft Business Standard license, or maybe I'll get a Business Premium license, and that's when there are 10 people or so. And it's like, okay, that's not a bad strategy when you're 10 people. You're trying to make hay, but then they quickly go from 10 to 50 to 200, and now things are a lot more dynamic. Those are users in different places. And I think those, for us, that's when we start having the conversation with them, which is, hey, is it time to shift into best of breed? Because ultimately that's going to make things more efficient and more secure down the path. And so, from a candid, open, honest perspective, I think there's times when that can make sense, but times when to start thinking, hey, something is going to get a little bit more complicated. So bringing up I think the defender side makes a lot of sense. So you brought up rollback, a number of the MITRE results, the multi-tenancy. You also brought up the feature parity, and so I wanted to go to Nick and get a little bit deeper into that. So we talked about users being all over the place and outside the firewalls, things like that. And so maybe if you could start, and we'll get a little bit deeper as we go, but start with the feature parity, what's available, and what that really is. I think that's a great next place to go for us.
Thank you, Gary, and absolutely. And hello, everyone. Nick Caudill, Solution Engineer over here at SentinelOne. Just as a little bit of my background, I've been in the industry for a little over 15 years now, 2+ years at Sentinel, 2 years prior as a technical account manager at Carbon Black, and then better part of a decade as a senior support engineer for supporting semantic endpoint protection and Veritas Net Backup. So a wide variety of different solutions and more of the technical support than the sales portion of it. So with that being said, Gary, exactly as you're saying, sir, as we're looking through the technologies and that feature parity, the thing about SentinelOne is that we are here to provide autonomous protection, and we want to take as much of the workload off the analysts and admins' shoulders as much as possible, as well as be the least impactful on the endpoints themselves. And so we are protecting those assets, whether they are within the corporate network or enterprise network or outside, let's say a coffee shop, or especially in the last few years as the workforce really has moved to that broadened remote workforce, we can still provide that full feature parity. So for example, we are only communicating from the endpoints to the console on port 443. So regardless of VPNs and proxies in place, we can bypass and communicate with all of that. We can function just fine out there as well as inside the corporate network environments. And so, for example, we bring about enhanced controls for things like firewall control or USB Bluetooth device control, so that if it doesn't match a specific rule, or even let's say back to the firewall control using something like location awareness, we can actually make the firewall rules be a little bit more staunch when we can no longer resolve that internal network that we would see within the offices. And so as users do travel further and further abroad or work more remote, we can absolutely pivot. Something as simple as a click within the console for a few policy changes can make all the difference in the world for that enhanced layer of protection. To kind of go just a little bit further into that, I mean, with the AI that we have utilized and the algorithms and the way that we have trained our agents, we are going far beyond, again, just the standard conventional methods and no definitions. I am sorry for kind of scattering there, but I cannot stress enough how useful it is to keep your security posture in place with having an agent that is fully functional, fully running at that kernel level and not relying on anything like definitions or even cloud connectivity. So even if an endpoint or asset is completely offline, we still have the full functionality. We just need to know what was the policies that we were assigned previous to the lack of network connectivity. In the meantime, any incidents, any activities that are captured, we are still correlating and able to provide the full findings, that marrying, if you will, of the EPP and the EDR, but focusing more on that EPP side. We will have, let's say, for example, as Gabe mentioned, should something get past the initial pre-execution engines that we have, we will then have our behavioral AI running through beyond that kill quarantine phase into a method of remediation and rollback. And so with all that being said, again, regardless of where the assets are located around the world, with or without that network connectivity, we still have the full functionality to be able to provide that enhanced layer of control and protection.
Good stuff. And I look forward to, I think when we come back to you next, we can roll up our sleeves a little bit and maybe get into, just a little bit more of the guts and details. If you want to show anything, great. If not, if we just talk through it, whatever works for you is best there. But I think that's a really good starting point. So just love to do, the quick recap. So, we just talked about a little bit about the service, some of the terminology around that we've heard from a, EDR EPP perspective. Then we got into, some of the core elements on, SentinelOne and who's in the space. And then, Nick took us through, feature parity and some of those starting components. So we're starting to paint this picture of, if you've ever been on one of these events with me before, in particular security, at some point I'm going to refer to NIST, because for me it's such a Rosetta Stone from a framework perspective, be able to talk about the components of layered security. And so, that identification piece. Where is your data? The protection piece is like, how do we put this underlying tools and process in place to protect the data? But then we get into the detection, response, and recover. So we're really looking, how do we protect our data? And then also, how do we detect activity? And this really, I think, is where things get, a little bit more interesting and more complicated. And the level of sophistication and automation that has improved over the last number of years has made a difference to that. Even when Chris and I started working together, probably 7, 8, 9 years ago, the resources from a SOC perspective were a lot more significant probably than they are today, because they're just having to do more heavy lifting. Triaging cases takes a lot longer. The speed at which they could go through the analysis took longer, and so we're making big improvements there, which ultimately means probably less people. But now we've got more data and more complex environments, and so we're asking our tools to do more. So this is exciting discussion. Given that, so Rick, kind of back to you about our services, how we're leveraging these, and really with Fluency when we're talking with our customers. We want to paint the full picture. We want to get the right amount of data. And to the point that we made earlier, we're not charging people for giving more data because we're doing that from a per user perspective. But outside of Endpoint sending SentinelOne sending its information into Fluency, what are the other critical data sources that we like to gather so that we can kind of have a full view from a security monitoring perspective, and a little bit on why?
Yeah, so I would say that we want to make sure we're capturing every component of the infrastructure and every asset that's part of that infrastructure. I think if we're leaving something out, that's not good, because we're creating a hole that we aren't capturing all of the right information. So when you look at the different the sources that we can capture, you can start with the traditional event sources, event log data, net flow data, and then branch that out into the application and management environment. So looking at the cloud environment, so we can set up data sources around AWS or Azure or GCP and pull that data and ingest that into Fluency. MS365 should be considered a source because you have all of your user data, your credential information, and everything that's being managed from a productivity app standpoint is coming out of MS365 in a lot of cases. And then also looking at the network and server infrastructure and VMs, if you have on-prem infrastructure, and taking those logs and ingesting that data into Fluency to really look for anomalies, credential changes, elevated access, and any of the things that are changing that are outside of the normal day-to-day behavior and administration of those devices. We want to make sure that we're capturing that information. And then in addition to that, we also have the ability to take the DNS layer security and function and pull that information in as well to look at the specific events around end user phishing campaigns and things of that nature, or clicking on an executable that's from a bad actor that's been attached in an email or something of that nature. So it's capturing that data so we can see that real time. And really for us, I think what's most critical is that onboarding process. We'll walk through with our customers a business impact analysis to really determine the layout of the infrastructure, the applications that are being utilized within the infrastructure, really to determine that we're capturing all of the right sources in order to protect, from a security posture standpoint, that organization.
No, that's helpful. And I mean, you bring up things that I think that are so important to the response piece. And Chris could certainly explain this better than I can, but like Fluency's ability to take that AD data and then map that IP back to a username through JSON. And now all of a sudden we know who this user is that's having the problem, then we can go attack that so much quicker, again, to try to prevent any sort of data loss before it occurs. So that's a great kind of segue into the how we pull all this data together. And then you mentioned AWS, Azure, GCP. So we're as a AWS Life Sciences competency partner and an advanced consulting partner, we have probably the majority of our organizations are in AWS. A lot of them have data in both AWS and Azure, some dipping their toes in the water in GCP, at least that we work with. And so Chris, with our You know, our primary customer base being heavily in AWS, with, you know, data and services and, you know, data lakes and doing that kind of life sciences analysis. Can you just maybe help everyone understand the differences and from a security perspective on securing a cloud environment versus a traditional, more on-premise environment?
Yeah, sure. So one thing about talking about cloud, and cloud is a piece of the new infrastructure. So we have, of course, IoT, OT, and services. Cloud we normally divide into three buckets. We divide it as a service, as an infrastructure, or as a platform. AWS really is mostly IaaS and PaaS kind of services. So all three of those require us getting the data back. But the biggest issue around cloud is a misunderstanding what cloud is. Most people say the cloud is someone else's computer, and as soon as someone says that, move on to the next guy. And the reason is because cloud is a division between computational, networking, and storage. They're all separately billed and separately managed. The management of those don't occur in the node itself, in the platform. They occur at the control plane level. And this is what separates one cloud service from another, is the control plane itself. So in the case of AWS, we collect that data from CloudWatch, CloudTrail, and the API connections of the service itself. That data comes back. Now, there is no AV for the cloud. So all cloud, whether it's a service or any of the data that comes back, except for the different platforms we run inside of it, all that data has to be analyzed outside of the cloud. And this is the reason why it's one of the bigger weaknesses, because people say, hey, do you have an endpoint protection? There is no endpoint protection for this. This data has to be analyzed. The analysis of that goes back to that word before, indications. So we can only do is analyze indications. Now, the other thing that's happening is it's kind of complicated. The other thing that's happening is understanding the difference between the data coming back and what we call the derived data, or how we can detect. So most systems today are doing what we call anomic detection or atomic detection, which means that it's just looking at that element and doing field value matching, right? That is the state of the art, unfortunately, when we look at the endpoint protection players playing in this space. At the SIM level, it's a lot more different. And here we're looking at two different things. One is correlation, and we're not talking joins. Again, if you go back to joins, it's a huge mistake. Correlation is not joins. Correlations are set theory or analysis. We have to look at things that when a person logs in, everything after that. So time-oriented requires streaming analytics. The other thing is it needs to be stateful. So if you think about when you do a search and you do a time period of a search, right? That time period, if you can do a time period and say, give me a count, give me an aggregate, you're actually doing basic analytics. And that can't be done if you only look at one record at a time. So when we're looking at cloud, there's a significant amount of power that has to occur on the analytics side for you to perform cloud correctly. That's the reason why I've been teaming with PTP and other MSSPs, because that requires more intelligence on the analysis side, and the onus of evaluating that data is no longer in a product. It has to be in people, right? Somebody has to write the indicators. And so as all this data comes in, the indicators are added. There is an open source called the Sigmas, but the Sigmas are really mostly focused on Sysmon indicators. And so there's a huge gap in the understanding of indicators for cloud. Anyway, so that moving forward, you can see that the cloud is a brand new space. There's not many players who actually understand how to do detection in the cloud. The AV vendors, all of them are trying to move to the cloud to perform additional, but right now, most of that analysis is in connection and pulling of the data and writing with atomic-oriented signatures. So cloud analysis is absolutely huge, but to do it, if you're going to do it as a company, you better outsource it.
Super. So, I mean, there's a lot there, I think, to react to, but just to keep it probably at probably my level. How's that? Keep it at my level. It is, you know, there's the, from a layer, I kind of go back to the layered approach. There's the discipline to, you know, the right architecture. And so, you know, a little bit of PTP marketing, being able to make sure that your AWS environment is well architected, that you understand that you're looking at security issues and you're analyzing configurations within the cloud and being able to kind of have a practice around addressing those. But then the secondary piece is, and that this is why we think the combined platform that we have with SentinelOne and Fluency and our analysis is so critical, is the ability to see what's going on from a day-to-day basis. It's one thing to set things up against best practice. It's another thing to be watching it and responding to that on a 24/7 basis. And so appreciate Chris's explanation of kind of some of the nuances there and how that cloud platform changes things. Because as he said, at the end of the day, it's still disk and it's still CPU, but it's that what makes AWS and others special is that entire, front end control plane that allows you to do all that, kind of auto magic deployment of those resources. And so, trusting a lot in that control plane. And so when you put trust in, it's also some checks and balances to be able to, hey, I need to make sure that this is working or as secure as it should be. So super. So would love to now kind of come back to Nick and Gabe, and we touched on some of the differentiators. We talked a little bit about the feature parity. I think now, to the extent that you guys would like to, kind of roll up your sleeves and give us a little bit more about hey, here's the real engine. And so for our users, when they're thinking about other choices in endpoint protection and EDR, really kind of maybe dive into some of those key areas and show us what you can about why they should be thinking heavily about maybe looking at SentinelOne as a solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Gary. What I was thinking is that Nick and I will take turns. I'll just share just a brief explanation and answer to your question. But really want to kind of highlight what Chris and Rick are really saying is that the way that things are moving, security has never been more important. It would be foolish for us to think that SentinelOne was the end-all be-all when it came to protecting in the environment. We're a piece of the puzzle. And in order to do that well, we have to have integration partners. And I think, when we talk about PTP and we talk about Fluency and the synergy that we all bring together, it kind of centers around not only best of breed technology, but how do you respond to these incidents as fast as possible with as little resource utilization as possible. And the tools are there, but it's really how do you put that together and architect it in a way that the client really gets a true benefit. Some of the things that I want to highlight before I transition over to Nick is that one of the things that impressed me when I moved from Symantec to SentinelOne was cloud connectivity or not, and knowing that we could protect these endpoints while we're disconnected. I think that sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. And if you think about some of the environments that we protect, some of those are air-gapped environments. Some of those have literally no connectivity, but they shouldn't have any less protection just because of that. And then another area where we saw, 40% or more of all ransomware attacks were launched in a mobile application environment. So just knowing that the frontier has never been more spread out and being able to protect all those attack surfaces, I think are two critical things that are food for thought for anybody evaluating a next-gen AV solution. But I think if we really want to, look under the hood, I want Nick to share his screen and talk about rollback, deep visibility, and cloud funnel, specifically deep visibility and some of the remediation steps that we have. Because I think when you're dealing with automation that's as powerful as ours, you just get to a point where you just expect it to work. But now we're going to see how the sausage is made and why we really have won that award through Gartner multiple times. Oh, it looks like Nick might not be able to share, but I guess maybe I
can touch on it though. I apologize, you guys. I thought I had all permissions for Mac, and it says, "Oh, you do, but you must restart WebEx to do this." So,
always the case. Not a problem. I think being able to, you do a great job of explaining it, Nick. So
thank you so much, and thank you, Gabe, and gentlemen. Just like we're saying, that Fluency, with PTP, with SentinelOne, all integrating and working together. The thing that I like to promote for SentinelOne especially is the fact that while you guys have everything as far as the analysis coming in and the controls in place, again, going back to that idea of autonomous protection, we do also go far beyond just the protection itself. And with that EDR and with that data collection that we are providing across all endpoints and server types out there, Mac, Windows, Linux, Kubernetes, I mean, there is definitely a big pivot, a big shift to the cloud. And so we are definitely honoring that pivot as well. But we don't want to lose focus either on the fact that, I'm sorry, endpoints are not going anywhere, right? I mean, all users have to have something to connect to communicate with, to be able to get the job done. And so with deep visibility and complementing the remediation and rollback capabilities that we have, using our more advanced EDR tools like deep visibility, we have the ability to essentially query the data, the event types that are taking place across the board, across all endpoint types. And again, it's promoting that idea of feature parity as well. So it doesn't matter if I have a Linux server or a Windows 10 box, I can get very much the same data collected and provided to get the same results. And so it's consistency. And so, for example, with deep visibility, which is our advanced EDR tool, I've had customers come up to me saying, Nicholas, no pressure on you guys, but we have servers that we weren't looking to protect. They were more air-gapped and hardened in the environment. And they actually had the audacity to say to me as a pre-sales engineer, no pressure on you, Nick, but our job is literally on the line here if data is ever exfiltrated from one of these servers. Talk to me about DLP or FIM. And I would have to say, no, sir, we do not provide DLP or FIM natively yet. Story for another day. But in the moment, though, using our more advanced tools like the deep visibility data capture, we were then utilizing a query, essentially containing kind of like a SQLite language, if you will, gentlemen. We have a query targeting a server. Server, let's say, endpoint name contains the name server A, B, or C. Then we went a little bit further and I told him, let's use an and statement and let's target, let's say, for example, the file paths for any direct databases of your customer data being hosted. He says, no, Nicholas, I don't want to look at anything like that. I want to know about any data, any files of any location across my servers that would be essentially leaving the server through some kind of network communication. So I said, very good. Let's go ahead and then do something of a certain file size. Okay, so now we're looking at file name may contain, and or file size greater than or equal to 50 kilobytes, or endpoint, or excuse me, file name contains .rar, .zip, any kind of containment or zipped compressed file type. We can look for that as well in the same moment, in the same threshold of the commands. And then finally, a destination IP that cannot be empty. So now, while that would give an alert and originally through deep visibility, and our customers could have a notification at minimum, or let's say Fluency gets suddenly a triggered event that says, hey, we have a hit on a query that we just got from Sentinel showing that some data is being potentially exfiltrated from this server that should otherwise not take place. We've now also implemented another tool in deep visibility, which is, of course, our cloud funneling. Now that's forwarding the data over to a receiver. So essentially very similar to like SIEM, syslog connectivities. It gets a little bit more complex than that. But another feature on top of that to help complement, again, further autonomous protection is our STAR rules. And STAR stands for Storyline Active Response. And now what we can do is take a deep visibility query, a custom query that any of you could write in the environment. And then with these STAR rules in place, you're now having SentinelOne provide autonomous actions and responses, thereby very much writing your own playbooks. So if, let's say, we would never have captured that as an autonomous event because it's all through, let's say, conventional methods of communication, because one of the end customers in your environment has a concern about proprietary data or anything leaving that environment, we can then utilize a STAR rule to not only find results, but then respond to it appropriately, such as mark as suspicious, mark as malicious, or even a network-based quarantine. So the whole point is not just the fact that providing the autonomous protection, but allowing our analysts and admins in the environments out there to be able to write more granular custom rules and knowing that SentinelOne can actually take appropriate actions against it, again, autonomously.
Nick, what's an example of, so we would work with people with STAR rules all the time. What's one of the big examples you like to give about that?
Oh, absolutely. So like, for example, a jilted employee is laid off, and by that Friday, they go to turn in the company asset and turned around and decided to wipe out as much company information as they could. But because of controls in place through things like GPO or rules to prevent things like running a format of a company asset, let's say that user goes through and just manually deletes hundreds of files, the notes and documents, reports, all proprietary data to the company. Uh, my IT admins using SentinelOne and that complete package of deep visibility in those servers, we were actually able to target a query that said username contains the name of that user, and any endpoints out there that does not contain the name of his own system or any other systems, let's see those results. So ultimately, using those queries, we could then target very specifically what actions were taking place across all assets in the company, all based on that one user. So then by targeting that one user, we can then get more granular results of targeting just the file events that that user has detonated under their profile that was recorded through Sentinel. And then using, again, those rules within deep visibility, target those actions, mark them as an incident, and using the rollback technologies, restore just the files and actions that were impacted by that one user without having to rely on a full system restore.
That's really, really well said. And I think, as I think about that, we get a common conversation, I think, that we get just working on the front lines with customers, and I'm sure all of you do as well, is, at some point somebody says, hey, the CEO told us just, not to have a breach. It's like, okay, yeah, I get that. So it's impossible to say no, but what we can do is apply the right layers and the right process and the right people to this to make it very challenging to do that. And then we always work with customers, like every customer only has a certain amount of money. So, I personally like to bring in the economic law of diminishing returns and say at some point, your investment starts to get like this, to where you have incremental spend increase with very exponential spend increase with very incremental gains. And so, at some point you can't afford what Bank of America has from a security perspective, but our organizations that we're working with that are 50, 200, 250 people, the things that we're talking about today are affordable things, and they're things that give you incredible amount of visibility into what's going on. And from that layered approach of data protection and then detection, and having an organization that understands the space like we do, working with Chris and his Fluency team to automate that platform, and with a solution like SentinelOne to provide that intelligence that's, again, to the points you made, that's autonomous, whether you're connected or whether you're unconnected, and rollback and feature parity against all your systems. Those things become really important. So I think the message I would have back to our audience is, it doesn't have to cost a phenomenal amount of money to have the right controls in place, but you do need to consider things like, when we talk about data sources, is we've got to get the right data points to really be able to effectively do our job. So anyway, those are some of my takeaways. We've got a few minutes left in our allotted time. I don't know if anyone has. I usually like to just kind of open it up to anyone, that if you have any parting thoughts, any things that you think that would be appropriate for our audience that I haven't asked today, and just maybe share some parting comments before we go, if you have any.
Well, I wanted just to ask the group. I got into an interesting conversation with Al from Fluency. He's always good for an interesting conversation. And what was interesting, or we kind of were looking at where the industry is going, and if you've been doing this long enough, it's never static. It's always going somewhere. And so, what I wanted to ask Chris and Rick, just what they see in the future, where you see endpoint companies like SentinelOne looking into things like data aggregation and log aggregation and things like that. On the flip side, whether it's Palo or even CrowdStrike or even Splunk to a certain degree, I think is trying to do some of the things that an endpoint protection company wants to do. And it seems to be that companies are moving towards trying to be everything to everyone. And so I was just going to ask you guys both, what you think about that, what you see happening with some of the bigger companies in this space, and if you think any one company is ever going to actually be able to deliver on the promise of XDR as an individual standalone company? I know that's a lot of questions at once there.
Yeah, that's a big one. So I think let's hit the roadmap one really quick. So the big question is, where are these companies going with EDR, XDR, or whatever? And you kind of got a little bit of hint, on Nick's answers is that, or I guess the issue is that it's data, right? So we're collecting all this data, we're duplicating our data. The data's getting more dense. The Hermes feed, which you guys call Cloud Funnel, I'm old school, it's what used to be called Hermes, is about between 700 megs to 1.5 gigs of data per day per system that's active. So if you think about it, you get 1,000 nets. I mean, that's over a terabyte of data per day, stored for a year. You're beginning to see the issue of data. And so what you found is that the big five have all gone into data analytics, right? SentinelOne bought Skylar, CrowdStrike bought Huminio, right? $400 million purchase. Then you have Splunk with their move to try to get Carbon Black, kind of interesting twist that way, where the data company is buying the endpoint. Elastic is another combination. I'm sorry, Elastic's Carbon Black. Splunk was Cisco with AMP. Microsoft with their KQL and their integration to their own data. They're all moving to these huge, massive data aggregations. Most of them are key value oriented. In fact, that's where SentinelOne stands today, key value oriented. The leader of the pack, obviously, is Splunk, because Splunk is using a Splunk processing language significantly higher. That's where Fluency. Right now, we've just announced, or we will be announcing, our River Analytics language, which is designed for basically analyzing the data, not just doing key value pairing, which is the industry standard. And being able to do it in real time is the big battle. Splunk attempted to do it in real time 2 years ago. They canceled that project. So right now, we're the only company doing real-time analytics with aggregated data. But that being said, that's where everybody's going. They're trying to get there, but you have to understand how difficult the problem is. We're talking about terabytes of data, and it used to be a big deal. Oh, I did 1 billion. Listen, we have one customer that does 20 billion events a day. Okay, so if you want to go over the numbers, the reality is scalability. And you hit a word, Gabe, efficiency. And people underestimate what that word means. Efficiency isn't just that I do it well quickly, it means I can scale it. And right now, the big battle today is, can you scale your data? And you might say, yeah, I'll give you a good example. There's a farming company, we'll call it that way, that does $4 billion worth of business. It requires 90 CPUs nonstop to analyze their data using Splunk, because they have 1,000 queries, right? And so the queries have to go over and over and over again. And this is a huge issue in our, right? It's not well designed for scaling and continuous monitoring. And that's where the big battle is right now, is in data analytics. Now, what are these companies going to do? The big guys are going to acquire. So don't think, if you're one of those guys, and I named you as one of them, realize that the strategy is to acquire this technology, bolt it in, bring it in, because right now, over the next 4 to 5 years, that's where the battle is going to be. Also realize that data doubles every 2 years. So if we're doing 20 billion a day right now, 2 years, I've got to be ready to do 40 billion just for one customer. So this is where the real competition is going to be, is can you scale this at the cloud level, or are you going to push it down? Now, Florian Roth and some other people on the Sysmon world with Aurora are trying to do it on premise or on device. That's one way of distributing the power issue. It becomes a manageability issue. Now I'm managing hundreds of thousands of endpoints and I'm back to DAT files. So, so the reality is we have a good answer going on. Where's the real battle? The real battle is no longer on the endpoint. It's on this infrastructure, IoT, OT, cloud, web services, SD-WAN, right? Cloud perimeter devices, SSE per devices. So right now we're getting more data, more complex, and the only way you can solve it is to store it in one place and analyze it. And all that complexity, I kind of hinted at this before, requires somebody to know what they're doing. And that's managed services. And the reason why I'm a big believer in the managed service piece is because, great, you're Wells Fargo, you can afford to have tons of people. But as you start reducing your staff loads because you can't afford to, you have a business to do, it's needs to be done on the devices. It needs to be done more simply, more atomically. But unfortunately, it does require intelligence, and there needs to be a career path for those people. And the MSSPs are the best career path for people in the mid to small marketplace to handle this complex issue.
Yeah.
And I was just going to add to that. I think when you're looking at the data set and how large it's become from all of the devices and all of the touch points within the infrastructure, that data set and that data ingest has become too large to just have eyes on glass and think that I've got eyes that are watching these alerts come in and that's enough, because it really isn't. I think you have to have some security orchestration and automation that's part of that, and that behavioral analysis where you're making those informed decisions, but you're doing it in an automated way versus I'm just waiting for my security engineer to get that event and then act on it. Because if you do that, you've already lost. You've lost the race at that point, because there's just so much data that needs to be analyzed to really create that security foundation that customers need, where they can rest easy at night. Being in the MSP world, I think we're seeing a lot of that, and it's interesting to see the different players and the different tools that are out there and that are part of that. But when you're thinking managed detection and response, automation and orchestration is part of that, as well as having the right security resources that are available to do the threat hunting and start looking into those threats and really cutting that off at the knees, and then determining, okay, we're sophisticated enough that we have customers and they've developed their processes around incident response plans, and how do the tools and the orchestration and the events, how do they roll up into an IRP, and how should that be managed? Because you've got a people component of that within the organization who need to know when a cyber event is going on. And then we also need to know who we need to contact and where do we need to get help. Because when the adrenaline is pumping and there's been an event and a breach and data is lost, you have to have those things documented, or you're not going to think of it at the time, because your brain's going to go to mush, because everybody's going to be scrambling that I need to go and I need to restore this right away. Well, no, you don't. We need to collect the forensics evidence. We need to collect the data. We need to use the tools and look at the logs so we can determine where exactly and who has infiltrated the environment. So I see more on the forensic side, the security orchestration and automation, and then having the right individuals that can do the threat hunting and mitigate those threats. So it covers all gamuts of it. So the people, the process, the technology, the tools, it's all part of it. And I think that's just kind of where that security landscape has evolved and where it's going to continue to go. And managing and storing the data is going to be a challenge as well, because there's just going to be so much of it. And then that leads to retention time and how much data, how far do you need to go back? Because it all comes with the cost as well. So.
Yeah, I would say, and I know, Gary, we got to wrap up, but I think that's why these partnerships are so valuable. Is it really takes a village to be able to do this successfully for a client. And I don't see any one company being able to step up to the challenge and solve it efficiently, Chris, to your point. So I just want to thank everyone for the time. I've learned a lot on this particular call. Gary, really appreciate you getting us involved, and love to do one of these again in the future if it ever comes up.
You bet. And thank you all. And I just, close with one thing that I think is important is, as a, managed service provider and a MSSP, we have a lot of the conversations with customers like, well, why aren't you just leveraging like an Arctic Wolf or Alert Logic or the MSSP built platform tools? And the reason why is, if our customers are not necessarily looking for the checkbox, our customers are looking for the best security detection they possibly can. And so this conversation is about how do you, provide the best protection at the endpoint? And then how does an organization like us that doesn't want to be fit into a particular box of what we can analyze get access to a platform that is data hungry and can receive logs from disparate data sources and has the rule set built in, and we can customize things at a degree that our security engineers want to, that's why. So for us, it's, yeah, would it be easier? We press the easy button and then just flip up a service and we're going to get a ticket that comes from one of those guys and we have very little heavy lifting to do? Yes, it would. But for us, you know, the brand and the commitment we have to our customers is number one. And that's why, you know, we're having this conversation and these are our platform partners, and that we've worked with Chris and the Fluency team for as long as we have. So, you know, we had that conversation all the time, but I just thought I'd kind of close with that context. So thank you guys. I know we're 3 minutes over. Really appreciate everybody's involvement. Chris, as always, great to have you on. You know, Gabriel and Nicholas, really appreciate you joining us. I'm sure we'll have many more conversations and many more direct conversations with our customers. And Rick, I know you're not feeling fantastic today, but really appreciate your input. Thanks to our participants for joining us. And then we'll have this up on video for on-demand viewing here in the next couple of weeks. So hope everyone has a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Take care. Thanks.
Gary, take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.